Hello, friends. Thank you for being with me. Subscribe, like, and let's get started.
Fred was coming home after a long day at work. Spent amongst the numbers and reports, his home was a haven of calm. He knew Megan would be on the couch with a cup of hot tea, wrapped in her favorite blanket. Janie, their teenage daughter, usually sat in her room talking with her friends. This routine brought Fred reassurance that all was well. That evening it started out the same way it always did. Fred took off his shoes in the hallway, the smell of lavender from Megan's favorite candle filling the house. From the living room came her light laughter. He knew that laugh. It sounded homely warm. Fred stopped on the stairs listening. "Oh, you're just silly." He heard her voice laughing at the characters in the sitcom. Fred smiled. He headed upstairs to say goodnight to Janie. Knocking on her door, he entered. She was lying on the bed, holding her cell phone in her hands. Her fingers were rapidly thumbing the screen, and her face was glowing with the light of the device. "Good night, sweetheart," Fred said, stepping closer, but realized she was wearing headphones and continued her conversation without noticing his presence. Fred was about to leave the room when he heard her words. "Yes, my mom was with him again last weekend." He froze without moving, his hands still resting on the door jamb. "Who is he?" Barely got out of his mouth, but a voice inside silenced him. "Yeah, she's not even trying to hide it anymore," Janie continued, a smile appearing on her face. "Imagine, she also told me to cover for her if Dad asked." Fred felt his heart pounding. Everything went cold inside. He took a step back, trying not to make a sound. "Well, he'll never know anyway," she added, a light laugh in her voice. Fred stepped out into the hallway. His legs barely held him up as he reached the wall and leaned against it. It felt like the air had been squeezed out of his lungs. He made his way downstairs where Megan was still just as cozy on the couch. She was holding a mug in her hands, her face relaxed. She looked like everything was perfect in her world. "How was your day?" Smiling, she asked. "Good," Fred replied, sitting down in the chair across from her. He stared at her, taking in every detail, every crease of her face. "How long has this been going on?" He thought. "Is something wrong?" Her voice sounded genuinely concerned. "No, just tired," he replied. Fred suppressed all the questions that were bursting out. He knew that if he started now, she would deny everything. He needed proof, facts, so she wouldn't have a chance to dodge. "You look exhausted," Megan said, rising from the couch. She walked over to him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe you should go to bed early?" Fred nodded. "You're right. I guess I will." Later that night, he lay in bed beside her. Her breathing was even and calm, but Fred couldn't close his eyes. Every word he heard from Janie echoed in his head. Mom was with him again last weekend. He closed his eyes, but found no sleep. Instead, he got up, heading for her office. It was a small space in the corner of the house that he rarely went into. His hands trembled slightly as he started going through the drawers. First drawer, stationery, paperwork, nothing out of the ordinary. Second, he found a receipt from a restaurant. It was an expensive restaurant where they only went on special occasions. But the date on the check was the night she said she went out with her friends. Fred stared at the check for a long time, feeling his chest tighten. Who is he? The question echoed over and over in his head. In her bag, he found a napkin with the restaurant's logo on it. He touched it with his fingers, feeling like he was invading her life. Back in the bedroom, he glanced at Megan. She was sleeping as if nothing had happened. Fred closed his eyes, but inside everything was boiling. The next morning he made breakfast as usual. Janie was eating cereal while listening to music on her headphones. Megan was looking for something on her phone. "Do you both have plans for the weekend?" he asked, trying to sound calm. Megan smiled. "I'll probably meet up with some girlfriends." "How about you?" Fred nodded. "I'll think about it." But inside he already knew he was going to start digging deeper, because he couldn't take it anymore. Fred felt the world around him crumbling, but there wasn't a shadow of doubt on his face. He lived as if everything was still the same, working, smiling, talking to Janie and Megan, but there was a growing sense of tension inside. He needed more proof. That evening, after dinner, he suggested that Megan watch a movie. "Oh, I'm sorry," she replied, dodging his gaze. "I promised a friend I'd help her with her new project." Fred nodded. "Of course you did. You're always so busy. Well, you know how it is? You don't mind, do you? She came over to him, putting her hand on his shoulder, and her smile was as warm as ever. Of course not, he replied, though everything was boiling inside. Megan left, saying she'd be back late. Fred gave her a look, standing at the window, and then went straight to her office. He knew this was a chance to find out everything she was hiding. Fred opened the drawers methodically, checking every piece of paper, every check, every note. But everything he found seemed ordinary. Stationery, shopping lists, utility bills. Nothing suspicious. He was about ready to leave when he suddenly noticed a notebook hidden between the books on the shelf. It was a small, unremarkable notebook. When he opened it, he saw something that made his fingers tingle. On the first page was a list of dates, and across from them were places. Some of them he recognized. They were the very nights Megan had said she'd been at her girlfriend's house. September 23rd, La Pietro Restaurant. October 15th, South Bay Beach House. He turned the pages, and each time the entries became more personal. December 10th with D. You make me feel alive. The name wasn't spelled out in full, but the letter D flashed across several pages. D, Fred whispered. Who are you? His head spun. He slammed the notebook shut and put it back down. It was clear to him now. She wasn't just deceiving him. She was leading a whole double life. When Megan returned late in the afternoon, Fred was sitting in a chair, pretending to doze off. She closed the door carefully, walked past him, and froze when she saw him raise his head. Are you still awake? I couldn't sleep, he answered. How's your friend? Fine, Megan smiled. She said hi to you. She did? Fred smirked. I wonder what kind of friend this time? Megan froze for just a moment, but recovered quickly. Kate, of course. You know her. Of course I do, Fred replied calmly. She kissed him on the cheek, not noticing his tension, and left for the bedroom. The next day, Fred continued his search. He remembered that Megan sometimes left her phone in the kitchen when she went to shower. He didn't like prying into other people's lives, but right now it was the only way to find the truth. When he heard the sound of water running in the bathroom, he gingerly picked up her phone. The password was simple, Janie's birthday. Entering her messages, he felt his breathing quicken. There were correspondences with several friends, but one stood out, one with a man signed simply D. He opened the chat, and the first message made his chest clench. Last night was amazing. I can still feel your touch. Fred slowly leafed through the correspondence. The messages were intimate, full of hints about their meetings, places they'd been, and plans for the future. When can we see each other again? I miss you. You're the only one who makes me happy. Fred closed his eyes, feeling the world crumble around him. In the evening, he tried to talk to Janie. She was sitting in her room, engrossed and leafing through her cell phone. Janie, he called, sitting down on the edge of her bed. Yes, Dad? I was wondering, he paused, gathering his wits. About Mom. Janie looked up sharply. What about her? Is she seeing someone a lot? I mean, other than her girlfriends. Janie blushed and looked away. Dad, I don't know what you're talking about. Do you? He asked gently but insistently. You've always told me the truth, haven't you? It doesn't mean anything, she blurted out. It's just she deserves to be happy, Dad. Fred felt his heart clench. What about me? He asked quietly. Don't I deserve that? Janie looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. I didn't want it to be like this. Then why didn't you say anything? Because she's my mom, Janie shouted. I couldn't betray her. Fred stood up, his hands trembling. Could you have betrayed me? She answered nothing, and he left the room, feeling his anger overwhelm him. Later that night, he found himself in her office again. He found the date of the next meeting with D written down. Now I know where you'll be, he thought, clenching his hands into fists. Fred decided he wasn't going to wait any longer. The truth was ahead, no matter how painful it turned out to be. Fred lay awake all night, replaying the events of the last few days. The conversation with Janie, Megan's correspondence, the notebook, all of it pointed to one thing. He could no longer trust his wife. By the time it got light, he had no doubt. He had to leave. But first he had to finish his search. The next day, after waiting for Megan to leave the house, Fred returned to her office again. He sat down at his desk, his hands trembling slightly. He realized that this moment could change everything. His gaze fell on the drawer where her laptop lay. He hadn't paid much attention to it earlier, but now he decided to check it out. The laptop was locked, but Fred knew her habits and easily picked up the password. When the screen lit up, he immediately saw many browser tabs, but one caught his eye. It was email. He opened it and saw emails from D. I can't wait for Saturday. Do you still remember our deal? Just you and me, no stress. You're everything I want, Megan. You make me feel real. Fred copied the correspondence onto a flash drive. He had proof now, but every word he read stabbed into him like a dagger. He began to prepare for his departure. He transferred the money into a separate account, packing at night while Megan slept. Her calm face, as she lay beside him, made him bitter. How long has she been lying to me? How many times has she sat at this desk, texting him, pretending everything's okay? Everything he packed was a reminder of what he was losing, but he realized he couldn't go on living like this. Friday turned out to be an ordinary Friday. At dinner, Megan seemed calm, even animated. Janie was her usual self, although she avoided making eye contact with her father. What are your plans for tonight? Fred asked, looking across the table at his wife. Megan smiled. Just relaxing, I guess. Maybe take a bath and read. Sounds good. He nodded, pretending to believe her. Janie looked up at her mother, then at her father, but remained silent. After dinner, Megan retired upstairs, ostensibly to rest, but half an hour later Fred heard her office door slam quietly shut. Fred waited, lurking in his office. When he heard the front door slam, he quickly looked out the window. Megan was coming out of the house, dressed in an elegant black dress. She got in her car and drove off without looking back. Let's get started, Fred said quietly to himself as he grabbed his car keys. He knew in advance where she was headed. Megan had mentioned this place in her notes. It was an expensive establishment on the other side of town where they had once gone together. Fred parked in front of the restaurant. His heart was beating like a drum, but he was determined. He saw Megan get out of the car and head toward the entrance. Fred entered the restaurant following her, trying to keep his distance. The soft light from the chandeliers illuminated the tables covered with white tablecloths. Megan sat at one of them, her face lighting up as a man approached her. He was tall, athletic build, with graying temples, dressed in an expensive suit. Megan reached up to hug him. Fred felt his body tense up. He quickly sat down at the nearest table, trying to remain inconspicuous. You're beautiful as always, the man said, sitting down across from Megan. Thank you, Daniel. Her voice sounded soft and warm. Fred clenched his fists. It was the first time he'd ever heard the name D. Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything? Daniel asked, leaning forward. Absolutely, she answered. Fred's too trusting. He doesn't even ask questions. Those words hit Fred harder than he'd expected. He felt something inside him break. I can't hide it anymore, Daniel continued. You deserve to be happy. I know, Megan said, taking his hand. Fred couldn't hold back any longer. He rose from his seat and walked over to their table. Deserves it, you say? His voice was quiet, but threatening. Megan turned sharply, her face going white. Fred! Daniel stood up, but Fred took a step closer, looking directly at Megan. So, this is what you were doing when you said you were at your girlfriend's? It's not what you think it is. Megan started to justify herself, her voice shaking. Oh, really? He tossed the printout of messages he'd found on her phone onto the table. Then explain it. Daniel tried to intervene. Look, I think we can discuss this calmly. You shut up in general, Fred said coldly, not taking his eyes off his wife. Megan tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. How long did it last? Fred asked. A couple months, she said barely audibly. Lies, he replied, nodding at a notebook he pulled out of his pocket. It's got dates for the last 2 years. Megan grabbed her head. Fred, I didn't mean for it to turn out like this. How did you mean it to? He leaned closer to her. For me to live in ignorance? For Janie to keep covering up your lies? Daniel tried to intervene again. Look, you shouldn't be setting this up here. Fred turned slowly toward him. You have no idea what it's costing me to hold back right now. Daniel backed away without saying another word. Back at home, Fred felt devastated. He closed the bedroom door, leaving Megan alone with her excuses. Later that night, he heard a knock on the door. It was Janie. Daddy, Her voice was quiet, almost guilty. Are you okay? He looked at her, her eyes full of tears. I knew, she said. I knew all along. Why didn't you say anything? He asked, his voice full of pain. I was afraid you couldn't handle it and would leave us. Her voice trembled. Did you think I wouldn't recognize that? Janie lowered her head. I'm sorry. Fred felt tears come to his eyes, but he held back. You know what, Janie, he said after a long pause. I can't stay here any longer. What? I'm leaving. Her face contorted in pain. No, Daddy, please. You've seen all this time, what's been going on, and you've done nothing. I can't live with this. Fred then pulled out his suitcase, which had been packed in advance. He hesitated, gathering his thoughts, even though the decision had been made long ago. He needed to leave. Megan entered the room, her face pale. She noticed the suitcase immediately, and her eyes filled with alarm. What are you doing? She asked, her voice trembling. Fred turned, looking straight at her. I'm leaving, Megan. Leaving? She stepped closer, her step sharp. What are you talking about? You can't just walk away. I can, he said quietly but firmly. And I'm leaving. Megan grabbed his arm, her voice turning hysterical. No, we can fix this. I know I messed up, but I'll fix it. Please, Fred, don't do this. He took a step back, releasing his hand. Will you fix it? He repeated with a bitter chuckle. You ruined everything we had. Everything. It can't be fixed anymore. But we can try, she shouted. For Janie's sake, for our family. Fred looked at her, and there was no longer the pain in his eyes that she was used to seeing. For the sake of our family? His voice was cold, almost emotionless. Were you thinking about family when you met him? Were you thinking about Janie when you involved her in your deceptions? Megan was silent, her lips quivering. I made a mistake, she whispered. A mistake? Fred exhaled sharply, as if he couldn't believe his ears. It's not a mistake, Megan. It's a betrayal. She sank down on the bed, covering her face with her hands. Please, she said through her tears. Please, Fred, give me another chance. He looked down at her, his heart growing heavier by the second. It's too late, he finally said. I'm filing for divorce. Megan raised her head sharply, her face contorted with pain. No, you can't do that. You're just angry, but it'll pass. Fred picked up the suitcase again and headed for the door. You're right. I was mean, he said without turning around. But it's past. Now I just want to leave. What about Janie? She shouted, rising to her feet. Are you going to leave her? Fred stopped in the doorway. I'm not leaving her. I'm leaving her with you because I know she loves you more. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop being her father. Megan ran after him, grabbing him by the sleeve of his coat. Don't go, please. Fred turned around, his gaze hard. You've already lost me, Megan. Goodbye. The next morning, Fred visited the lawyer's office. He signed the divorce papers, feeling strangely relieved. It was a step he should have taken a long time ago, but only now realized it. Later, sitting on a park bench, he dialed Janie's number. Daddy? Her voice was quiet. Hi, honey. I wanted you to be the first to know. I filed for divorce. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Janie answered. I understand. I'll always be there for you, he assured her. I know, Dad. Just be happy, okay? Fred felt his eyes fill with tears. I'll try. Fred sat behind the wheel, looking at the road that stretched ahead as if inviting him into the unknown. Behind him was a house filled with memories, deceit, and pain. Now his future was a blank slate, but that didn't bring relief. More a sense of anxious anticipation. By the time he reached the small coastal town, the sun was already slipping towards sunset. He stopped in front of a modest two-story house with a sign that read for rent. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, met him on the doorstep with a warm smile. Welcome, Mr. Logan. I hope you like it here. It's quiet here, and the neighbors are mostly fishermen and artists. Quiet is just what I need, Fred said, shaking her hand. He went up to his new apartment on the second floor. The room was small but cozy, with simple wooden furniture and a window that overlooked the ocean. He was slowly being drawn into his new life. One morning, while Fred was eating breakfast on the balcony, his phone rang. The screen flashed with the name of Liam, an old friend. Liam? Fred was surprised to hear his voice. Hi, Fred. I was wondering how you were doing. Trying to start a new life. How are you? Liam was quiet for a moment. I heard something about Megan. Fred tensed. What was it? After you left, her life turned upside down. Daniel dumped her. Everyone found out about the affair, and her friends turned their backs on her. Even Janie. She moved in with her grandmother and stopped talking to her mother. Fred felt a heaviness in his chest. Janie? Yes. She said she couldn't see her mother anymore after what had happened. Fred closed his eyes, trying to digest what he was hearing. And Megan? She's alone. Everything's ruined, Liam said. But it wasn't your fault. You did what you had to do. I know, Fred answered quietly. After the call, he sat on the balcony for a long time, looking out at the ocean. He thought about how things had turned out and realized that he had made the right choice. He was free now, free to build his life anew on his own terms. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.